Today's May 2nd, 2024. I'm honored to have two luminaries compared to me, Mark Changizi and Ron Coleman. They have X personalities and X profiles, and they've been excommunicated from good society. So we're going to talk about that. How good is good society these days? I'll give the baton first to Mark because he's closest on in the middle there.
You want me to introduce myself, or you want to just?
Why don't we do that quick intro? I guess, sure, why not?
I would imagine some fraction of your followers know me. So I'm a cognitive scientist, undergrad math, physics, PhD math, but I became kind of a cognitive science evolutionary biologist. I lot of people got to know me before COVID because I had a lot of TED Talks and I had a TV show, and I was kind of just involved in public outreach about my discoveries, and I've got a bunch of books on the origins of why we are the way we are. But during COVID, I became on the front lines of arguing against the great COVID debacle and the authoritarianism, and trying to understand the totalitarianism that it led to. All of the experience that we had was a minor totalitarianism, something most of us that grew up in the West have never experienced and really didn't have a good feel for. So the kinds of things that I study as a scientist are these sort of emergent phenomena, selection processes, evolution, how you can get lots of design and structure despite there not being a God that designed it or an intelligent designer. A lot of the things that happen with throngs of people, a lot of the stuff that happens at the socio-political levels have to be understood in those sorts of ways, and that's the kind of thing that I'm good at. So I became both on the front lines pushing for freedom of expression, freedom and civil liberties, but also trying to understand these complex psychosocietal forces.
Ron.
I can't touch that. I'm just another lawyer. I do a lot of work in the freedom of expression area, and I guess that's perhaps one of the intersections. Actually, Mark's work is encompasses many of the categories that have been avocations for me as a matter of interest since my days as an undergraduate. We're dealing with, I think, a lot of the same issues, coming at them from very, very different perspectives. I'm also involved in civil liberties policy, both in terms of the legal work that I do and the writing and speaking and podcasting that I do. I don't really know what else to say besides that. Things will, I'm sure, come out in the course of this discussion, Randy.
Absolutely. I don't think either one of you are going to have much shortage for words. The word is logos, and we have all these ologies, which are logos, psychology, which is to put, the psyche into words. These became fields of endeavor, fields of study, and to a point, all well and good. Concepts in our university, and to make more puns, the university has maybe been killed by diversity, certainly not of thought, but of this kind of applique. And the reason I had both you come on through different prisms of looking at the world is to talk about the implosion of our university system and our methods of quote unquote higher. So maybe we'll start backwards this time. Maybe Ron, can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on campuses? You and I both went to schools with some kind of vine along the outside, but now it's poison ivy. So what's up with that?
There has been over the last 20 or 30 years, a very, very serious perversion of the academic mission. It has been very distorted by money and by, to some extent, many of the free market values that I, as a young conservative, thought were just the cat's pajamas in the 80s. That has had an effect on part of that perversion. We have taken the concept of academic inquiry and the related concept of tolerance for opposing views, which is the only way that you can progress in any field of study. Instead of making these things the necessary lubricant for running the engine of knowledge, they have become the engine, and all we have is a bunch of grease. We have so fetishized the idea of inquiry that we have actually seen in these brand name academies a contempt for the idea of objective truth, not only in moral or philosophical contexts, but even in what were once considered to be empirical areas of study. So, I think that's a decent elevator pitch for why things are going south down the shaft very quickly.
Mark?
If you ask these folks, most of the folks in academia, whether that's happening, I think most of them would say, no, we're open-minded. In a lot of these departments, 98% of the folks are Democrat. They have maybe a percentage or two of libertarians, and then some fraction of folks that voted Republican. And they literally have known nobody that voted for Trump. The entire range of ideas in all of the differences, of course, differences of opinions that they have amongst one another, we tend to lump them together as, sides of the opposition. From their point of view, let me give you an analogy. You've seen the New York-centric or the Manhattan-centric maps, right?
Yeah. New Yorker's view of the world.
It's all Steinberg.
It was a New Yorker article years ago. Manhattan fills up almost all of the earth, and then the rest sort of just exponentially just decays out. That's what's going on in academia. This is the reason I left academia. Even when I was in academia, I never wanted to stay within a field. When you stay within a field and you start attending their conference, you get to know, oh, they're so cool in the field. They've made all these discoveries. I want to become like them, right? And if I get into my mid-30s and I've got a couple discoveries on my belt, the young people start calling me sirs, and you love that. So you start to get embedded in that social community. The only ideas that matter are the ideas that they care about. The ideas in that other community are stupid. Your entire social space is spread out. That whole thing has spread to fill your whole social mind, just like Manhattan does in that space. The folks in academia think that they're open-minded. They feel that they're open-minded. The ideas that Republicans have and conservatives have, or even libertarians have, are taboo, right? They don't feel like they violated civil liberties when they tell you to put a shirt on or put pants on when you go into a restaurant, right? None of us even. You and I don't think that's a civil liberties violation because it's a taboo. And once things are taboo, it's not a civil liberties violation to say you can't do it. It's not a taboo. It's a taboo for me to have sex with my sister, right? Like brother and sister consensually want to have sex. Like who am I to say that that's disgusting? But I'm a libertarian, go ahead. It would never occur to me to make that illegal because it never occurred to me to think that that was a civil liberties violation, right? This is so gross. Universities are like that. The ideas that conservatives have are taboo, are so beyond the pale, so evil that they don't think that it's violating their notions of free expression and diversity, discounting people that are proponents of murder or incest. So this is why it's a consequence of there already being 97, 98% groupthink. So in that groupthink, they're not susceptible to the argument that you guys don't have a wide diversity of opinions. We have all of the opinions. Everything is in here. It's what they truly think, right? And that's a consequence of what has slowly evolved. Sorry, I'll let you go, Ron.
It's orthodoxy. What you're describing is a system of orthodoxy. Anything outside the cathedral is simply a non, like you said, it's not a point in the set.
Right. Most of them don't see it this way because once you're inside, again, your whole brain of all the allowable ideas, that whole space is filled up your whole brain. So the people, it's not like they go, aha, we've kept the conservative ideas out. They're not walking around like that for the most part because they really feel like they've got all the ideas. They're truly open-minded, diverse people. And that's the problem.
Story. I interviewed Nathan Kufness, who's a philosophy professor at Oxford. He's being dismissed possibly for some heterodox views. I'm not going to get into that too much. He said one thing: at university, they select, in a Darwinian way, I guess, they select for people who are studious. They like to do their homework. They like to do things for approval, and they are timid on the one hand. And obviously, there are some exceptions.
You mean for student admission or faculty appointment?
He's talking about professors.
Okay.
While we're talking, I had a conversation I had maybe 15 years ago with a law professor, and we were at a Sunday party on, maybe it was college. He was lamenting that these schools, before money was kind of released to the student athletes, he was saying, oh my God, it's just terrible. They're not students per se. They should only really have people in who can do the work of study. And study is not easy. I said, it's funny you say that. I had no idea you were also against affirmative action like me. He said, I didn't say that. Hold on a second. I said, I thought you just said you want people to go in based on standards of being able to do the work. He says, I'm not against affirmative action. The school should look just like the community. So people who apply to Dartmouth, they should only be white because that's Lebanon, New Hampshire. And he says, no. He had his various criteria, but the genie was out of the bottle in a sense, and he couldn't quite get it back in, law professor skills notwithstanding. And I think because he is a law professor, that he clearly has argumentative skills, yet has not come across this particular aspect of his own argumentation. There's a siloing of information. Their universe in the university is, kind of like an MC Escher little ball you're holding in the hand.
All right, but Randy, how much of that has changed since even the 30s and 40s? Faculties have always been yes, there's always been a handful. Let's think of the American Academy, because in Europe there, I think, have been historical instances of universities being centers of reaction. But in the United States, certainly in the 20th century, or at least from the 30s on, once the Jews start getting really involved in the university, in American scholarship, the vast majority of better schools have been very liberal places for a very long time. Something changed, though. Something has changed a lot very recently. And again, I don't want to say I don't care. A non-ideological or a non-politicized study of the humanities, of history, would be a great thing for America. But what scares me is the idea that in the world of science, technology, and engineering, we're seeing a retreat from empirical scientific standards, even including in the medical arts, that would just be utterly unimaginable when we were undergraduates, or even, I think, 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. Some straw broke the camel's back, Mark.
It's certainly true that even in the 80s, when I was an undergrad, the students were constantly stealing the conservative newspaper and throwing it in the trash in the mornings. And
yes.
David Horowitz, or I think it was David Horowitz, was being boycotted, or they were trying to stop him talking. So these things are not something that's just in the 90s and in the 2000s. Things have gotten qualitatively worse, if not worse, in the last 10 or 15 years. Something indeed has changed, and the only saving grace about the STEM fields are that instead of being 97, 98%, or in some cases literally 100% having voted Democrats in the humanities, they're only, 60 to 90%. I mean, they were still overwhelmingly far left. And I guess I would have typically thought that can't affect what they do, what they conclude, because ultimately it's very quantitative standards and rigor. But after COVID, you can see how that kind of assumption that I would have had, I think, if I had been asked, which I never really thought it through. Before COVID, I'd probably say, well, at the end of the day, they still have to deal with the hard reality of data, and as opposed to the humanities. Whereas that's entirely wrong. The entire interpretive frameworks can be completely biased by being in those groupthings. And so they can come to the belief that there's an altogether novel, disproportionately dangerous virus when there isn't. They can be biased to not seeing any of the iatrogenic deaths worldwide in April and May and March, April, and May of 2020, and still unable to sort of see that those things happened by virtue of the kinds of biases and groupthings that because they're sitting in that mess. And in fact, this is one of my part of my dissertation itself is on the origins of inductive reasoning. If you know nothing about the world and you're starting to get data for the first time, well, you have to give like a uniform probability distribution to all the possible hypotheses. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we give some hypotheses more than others. How do you understand how we get inductive reasoning up and going? This is called the problem of induction. And in fact, my solution to this sort of a 90-page paper in Synthesa, which is this philosophy journal, is showing how different paradigms or different conceptual frameworks. You might have a different conceptual framework than me in terms of the way you look at the world or the way you see the kinds of hypotheses. And you'll end up starting with a different prior than me. Now, in the long run, we'll converge. But it could be that for a very long, finite period of time, you and I disagree despite getting identical data. So different conceptual frameworks or different communities can end up biasing people for very long periods of time, even though in the limit, they'd eventually converge to the truth. So if you have messed up priors like COVID is altogether novel, well, then nothing that we know about respiratory viruses, including coronaviruses, apply. So suddenly we know all of this stuff about coronaviruses. Well, there's, its natural immunity is really strong. We know that applies. There's seasonality. It typically is just, 3 or 4 orders of magnitude more dangerous for the old, and it's pretty safe for the young. None of those things apply because suddenly the prior pushed all that information and said flattened it because it's altogether novel. So all of our prior information went away, and depending on your conceptual framework, because now you're just based on conceptual frameworks rather than all of these prior information. So different groups, namely academics, had a different kind of framework than those like me. You ended up with a long period of time where we differed and still seem to differ in terms of what the data say.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because your confidence in this eventual convergence seems perhaps a little overly optimistic.
I don't want to jump back in again, but there's more to say about that. So what I'm referring to is sort of a Bayesian kind of standard probabilistic kind of logic, but there's newer stuff that work. The way that social reputation works in societies is a lot like blockchain. When I give you Bitcoin, I can't say afterwards, actually, I never sent Ron Bitcoin. I still got all my Bitcoin. Well, the blockchain is a clever device that keeps memory of it and makes it really robust because it's a decentralized currency. There's no master list sitting in the bank someplace, right? Social currency is the same way. There is no gossip guru that sits there recording everybody's social reputation based on the interactions they've had and who lost face and all that, but it's spread across the community. Social narratives which get built over time, recording who lost face, who gained reputation over time, and all the kinds of events that relate to that. It has all of the properties analogous to blockchain. And what's great about it is that it can't be messed with, right? You can't mess with it and say, actually, no, I won that argument 2 years ago and I've got all the social reputation, whereas in fact, that was disgraced. It'll be typically remembered within the community and the social narrative will preserve it. You need to have some kind of mathematical thing that's distributed over the population that's decentralized to hold that information. But the problem is when it's ill-formed, it never goes away. It's almost impossible to make it go away. It stays forever. And this is the problem for the Jews. The social narrative 2,000 years ago started that somebody had to be probably put in this narrative that's a very human narrative to want some ethnicity or some people to be the truly evil people. It's asymptomatic, you can't see it, but they're true. The Jews fell into that and they will never fall out of it because these narratives just keep on chugging along and they cannot be broken up.
So you're ultimately agreeing, you're saying that ideally, if you had the level of transparency of the Bitcoin, the cryptological data that would be accessible to everyone so that you could ultimately see my wallet and see your wallet, and that would work and should work with social reputation. But in fact, you don't have that level of transparency out of the market for rehabilitation of their reputations.
It's because the social narratives which work like blockchain are working as intended. When they're functional. This is why most of us know the narrative about history and society. And it's pretty useful because no one can go back and mess with it. And this is why you know that there's some people that are high reputation. It typically works, and it's working as intended. The problem is that when it fails, there's a groupthink that's going along, and so the narrative gets formed during a groupthink rather than a bunch of independent, high reputation people coming up with ideas, and it tends to be a true consensus. When a groupthink ends up creating parts of the narrative, an inherent side effect of this otherwise pretty good mechanism that social networks use is that you end up with this permanence of ill-formed false things, often very, very contradictory things, can just sit there forever. Ideally, the old stuff in my dissertation was not thinking about social networks. It was just like if you're an ideal thinker and you've got these kind of priors that are determined by your conceptual framework, it's much more complex and tricky in real life.
Yes, it is.
I'm just going to segue slightly crimes for tax evasion. He was fundamental in the promotion. He was very involved with Bitcoin and its spreading and so forth. The irony is that the empire strikes back. You can have your own kind of blockchain interactions. We can kind of dig our way out of our own little psychological well, but we can also have the lid covered over our well so we can't climb out. All of us have experienced. I was off Twitter for a while because my posts were getting taken down. I got taken off YouTube and all that kind of stuff. So we have a lid on where we can go. Philosophically, I think there's no place we can't go. And thoughts are thoughts. You can think anything, but the fact of the matter is, you can also get sent to your room.
Dr. Seuss didn't say that. I just listened to the outstanding video narrator Simon Whistler list that on a list of 50 well-known things that in fact are false. The quote that you're referring to from Dr. Seuss, who was my commencement speaker, received an honorable doctorate. You're saying something more along the lines of what I'm saying, which is that the market or the environment, as someone trained in economics, my orientation is to think of markets, but whether you think of it as a market or a space or a system, Bitcoin in theory, when there is a problem with accounting in Bitcoin, when something is wrong, the mechanism exists to see that it's wrong. But in social networks, if that lid is on, or if that if someone is excluded from the network. Here you have the Jews, Marx, who are really adept at expressing themselves and at getting into networks. But whoever it was who crafted the narrative of the Jews was able to build into it a brilliant routine, which says the more effectively the Jews communicate the falsehood of the claims against them, the more that proves how true those claims are. They control the media. So you get into this, but that goes back to our problem of the lack of empirical truth. There are no standards. You have a Holocaust denial. Ike made them take pictures. Ike was working for the Jews. Oh, okay. The Polish government, like since post-communism, they've been, no, because the Jews have all the money and the Poles, like you can. This is now the same thing happens with colonialism and with white, white Christian nationalism, which, as we know, is the antithesis of a scientific hypothesis. If it's non-falsifiable, then we're not having a scientific discussion, right? But that's mostly those are the kind of axioms that we're dealing with now in social discourse.
Yeah. I presume that they've always been with us. Even by April, there was hosts, and even March, I think, of 2020, hosts of folks on my side, the anti-lockdown side, which were like, oh, this was all planned, a big pandemic. This was all in the works for 20 years to make all these things happen. And I was one of the few people that I know of, that I'm still aware of, that was going out of his way to argue as much against the lockdowners, which was what I was known for, trying to snuff out these crazy ideas. Because those sorts of ideas, there's a pandemic to do a great reset, or to stick vaccines, which is going to be a minor genocide for us, or to control all of these different kinds of things. And at the end of the day, and this in fact is what happened, at the end of this is going to end up with the Jews. The Jews are going to be the ones that are somehow involved. And this is in fact what happened. The anti-lockdown community has split as soon as 10/7 happened. Most of those folks that were the pandemic types are the woke right. We call them now the woke right, anti-Semites who...
Notice they're just asking questions.
Right. This is all a psyop, whereas the progressives are say, well, it may have happened, but 75 years, 75 years. Different kinds of distinct principles drive them, but they ended up in a horseshoe-like way, ending up with the same sorts of positions. These sorts of people are always with us, and so I've been trying to snuff them out for 4 years with lower and lower visibility because of all the censorship, and still to this day, I'm still going down. And so I'm unable, they're unstoppable in some sense, but I'm not really hoping to convince any of them. I'm hoping to stop other people from falling into that kind of well.
Yeah, that's the difference between Democrats and Republicans. Is Democrats are trying to sink the ship, and Republicans are trying to sink it less slowly, more slowly.
Well, this is related. So you remember when this started in 10/7? So we've got all the universities, just for anybody watching this. Like right now, the universities are all on fire, and there's all this fighting because there's all these, from my point of view, anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas, pro-Islamic Republic of Iran folks out there who are deeply confused and, in my opinion, deeply evil. But 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, when the initial university protests happened, being anti-Semitic, suddenly they were all brought to Congress or Senate, and they were all doing these Senate hearings, right? And so Claudine Gay was up there as one of the many university presidents, trying to explain their lack of consistency on their safe spaces and university speech, because you can hardly say anything in these universities without being accused and kicked out and canceled, right? So what happened then? Well, suddenly Chris Rufo, who I don't really know who this guy is, but his name, suddenly he made the entire debate about Claudine Gay having done some plagiarism during her dissertation. I was like, okay, well, maybe we should get her for that some other time. But the entire conversation came about that. And I started doing videos and tweets like, this is missing the point, folks. The point is the inconsistency of these universities, and you haven't solved anything. If you win this, then so what? We've won some debate that nobody's on the other side of. Nobody's out there defending. Everybody should be allowed to plagiarize. And there's no other side to this. No one cares. But everybody, all they wanted to do was do a witch hunt, which is what the woke left does. They felt blood, and they wanted to go witch hunt their opposition. Right.
Christopher comes from that sensibility. I think he's a former leftist, and I'm all for Claudine Gay's being prosecuted for plagiarism. But it's kind of the Andrew Cuomo effect, where he kills. I put kills in quotes. He allowed danger to occur to tens of thousands of oldsters, popping them back into nursing homes with popping COVID cases back in and making those others susceptible. That was, as you mentioned earlier, the 10,000, 100,000 times more vulnerable population. And yet, when it came time to get rid of them over that, I think they did the legerdemain, the magic act of looking somewhere else. So it's all about his theoretically groping something. They always get you for something that's anodyne, relatively speaking, although it's Me Too-ish. They get you for something else because they don't want to talk about that other thing. They don't want to talk about the COVID deaths. And so it's always a matter of distraction.
Right. So the actual conversation about the inconsistency of universities' speech relative to anti-Semitic protests compared to all the others never happened. It just failed to happen. Everybody was so excited that she lost her job, but still retained her $950,000 a year job, salary. Somehow they still felt that they won something. But now we can see over the last 3 weeks, the universities are 10 times worse in this regard. It made so that the right is useless, in my opinion, in terms of actually engaging in the actual discussions. And they should have been humiliated at that time for their inconsistent policies about free speech. It all got sidetracked. The right ended up looking just as woke cancel culture as the left, and they ruined it. And Chris Rufo was brought up as a hero and run down the street by the right.
When you say, Mark, the right ended up looking as woke and cancel culture, are you talking about the House bill that passed yesterday, or are you talking about Mark Rufo?
I was talking about 4 or 5 months ago during Rufo, and I just sort of barely noticed. I didn't really understand what that was about. I don't like the idea of Congress talking about what's hate speech or what's not hate speech. I want to hear the crazy crap people are saying. I want people to be allowed to say it because that's how I know who to lower the reputation of and to humiliate.
I had a relatively viral tweet yesterday. It just occurred to me sitting on an airplane coming back from California, which was, we don't need hate speech laws. Hate speech laws, first of all, are unconstitutional. Hate crimes, hate enhancements for what are otherwise criminal, I believe are unconstitutional as well. And property crime, because they've become so politicized. And legislators let them do this. And it's much easier to pass symbolic hate speech laws, like the one that passed the House yesterday, than it is to pass a law saying that no prosecutor shall be entitled to discretion with respect to prosecution on the following grounds. To actually address the problem with our law enforcement regime, which is at the root of so much of what we're talking about. We can do it in the streets and we can do it on the campus. No one will do it. It's much easier I raise my hand and I'm in favor of freedom. I'm in favor of apple pie. Right.
Yeah. I mean, we see these things create bad precedents. They're just going to be taken up by some other aspect. You have to kind of let things percolate through. And I agree. I mean, there's been this great fallout. I think Marcus talked about it and hints at it in the freedom group from the lockdown days into these two camps. Norman Fenton has spoken about this, that he was a great crusader, mathematical mind, and parsing out the statistics and all that kind of stuff during COVID, and the disappointment at seeing how people go for the next thing, which I guess is most recent next thing is the Hamassaker, and people not being able to discern. If you thought you had a hook on the truth in COVID, and then not to see it now, and fall into these false narratives. And the protesters there about putting the quote unquote Palestinian flag outside Hamilton Hall, now Hind Hall, but they didn't put the actual Hamas flag out. The Hamas flag is a little bit more blatant about what Hamas wants. It's the standard Arabic writing. I mean, you see in the Saudi flag and other flags and so forth, but you also see it in Al Qaeda's flag and ISIS flag and all this kind of stuff. And it's like they won't put that one up. They're doing the tricolor, but not everyone's all hunting down the narratives and hunting down what the experts thought. And here the experts are all locked arm to keep Jewish students from entering campus. I mean, who's the virus now? I think we've kind of isolated what the virus is.
Well, Randy, I mean, there is something here that requires real analysis, which is the adoption of the COVID mask.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same thing.
As a method of disguise, of permitting what seems to be an anti-doxing measure, but it's not. in most cases, these people are identifiable, and they have frequently been identified. What the use of these masks does several things. First of all, it puts the people who wear them on the right side mask. At the same time, masked demonstrators, they hide their identity, but they also add a factor of intimidation and threat. There's a dehumanizing aspect to removing the human face created in God's likeness that masks allow. That is part of what is going on here. It is creepy as hell.
You're exactly right. In videos that snuck out of their private meeting, the large majority of them were all wearing masks. This was not a public setting at all. They're wearing them as a virtue signal. These are a holdover. Nearly all of them were pro-lockdown, and it's sort of now spun into a continuing virtue signal about, within this world. And of course, it's also selected for anti-doxing measures and provides a kind of intimidation factor, just like white hoods for the KKK. All of these things are potentially selecting for their continued use. Yeah.
Female circumcision, genital mutilation. It's sort of prominent in Egypt and the Muslim world. I haven't gone to Google Ngram to look this term up, but I don't see much talk about it. About 20 years ago, it was in the news quite a bit that this was a bad thing. Women have the right to sexuality. They have the right to sexual pleasure. This is a cruel injustice. It's kind of a form of slavery. You're basically getting these girls married, but as servitude, to produce children, but not get any pleasure from it, so they're not going to stray. It's kind of like those remote ankle bracelets. Worse, it's kind of keeping you in check, validly abhorred. But you can't hear much about it these days because guess what? We do genital mutilation. It's not the same thing. We're not doing clitoridectomies, but we're taking younger children, even than the teen brides, those regions. And what are we doing? What is medicine saying about it? We've taken away the ability to talk about clitoridectomies in the Arab world. We can't talk about anything else in the Arab world. We, as physicians, have kind of indoctrinated ourselves to that. And I'm just going to put that out there, and you guys can either pick at it or not.
Radical Islam's representatives in the West will ally themselves with the American left, whose values are repugnant to Islam. And the American left will ally itself to radical Islam, whose values are repugnant to the left, to fight the common enemy of X, whatever you want to call X, whether it's colonialism, capitalism, white people, Jews, whatever the moment requires. This made it impossible. This was what shut down the discussion of female genital mutilation before we got into the sex change business. Do I think that it was meant to clear the ground for the sex change stuff? I don't think so. I tend to be extremely skeptical of long-term comprehensive conspiracy theories. But I do think that there's tremendous opportunism that's exploited by activists. You're right. This goes back to the beginning of our conversation. Questions that can't be asked. They're outside of the cathedral. You simply can't raise these issues. We're in a world where atrocities are performed against Jews on purpose, on video, and without any serious contradiction. And within a very short time, Jews are the ones against whom the word genocide is repeatedly used. This is a plan. That much I can assure you was not accidental. That part of it is a plan. So these alliances do work out very well. And the problem is they shrink the field of not only of what's acceptable discourse, of whether discourse may take place. Seeing videos of the last few days, people trying to ask these students in these encampments questions, and they're just told, we don't answer questions.
On the issue of female genital mutilation, a similar thing happened for face masks. So the Islamic Republic 2022 had one of their mullahs, the big deal with enforced. The entire world, Western world, is enforcing a face mask. So how do you say that we're so bad for enforcing hijab, which has all of these potential societal benefits? There's a point there. Like, who are we to say that they shouldn't enforce hijab when we're forcing and obviously useless. This is going to be on YouTube. I don't want to say the full sentence because they probably still, right? So that's problematic. It hurts us to engage in these sorts of things. It makes it easier for them to defend their practices. The other thing I wanted to mention related to masks and the use of the Israel is doing genocide. There's a similar, these are the pathway to virtue signals is always this. It starts off that certain people wear some kind of membership signal. They either wear it or they say certain sentences. And those things that they wear are either random so that a normal person wouldn't be doing it, or they're almost bad for you. You need to be wearing something that's random because otherwise just regular old people that are not part of my community would be doing it. So masks in March and April of 2020 was something that almost nobody wore, but a few people did. And these were the members of the COVID cult. They weren't being recommended at the time, but it provided a good signal that, hey, I'm a member of the I Care club. Once that starts as a membership signal, more and more people see it as a membership signal because it works as a membership signal, because people that are not in the club are definitely not going to wear it because it's stupid. But then what happens is that the community will over time evolve good arguments post hoc for why it's actually virtuous and good and helpful and useful. And the better arguments that come up, that bubble up, will then spread across, and other people will make them even better. And so soon you'll have 100 observational studies in 2 months which said that masks work, totally work. All the evidence says they work. It is selected for post hoc. What ends up being selected for are good arguments, good in the sense that they travel across minds really well. They're really infectious memes will evolve, justifying the membership signal and arguing very strongly that it's virtuous, good, everybody should do it. This is also what happened for genocide. In the beginning, genocide is the most extremely absurd point that you can ever make. Israel, more than any military historically, it has, even by the numbers that Hamas says, is still a 1-to-1-ish civilian to militant ratio. In an urban war with terrorists hiding behind civilians, it's still one of the lowest militant to, civilian to militant casualty ratios. It is so absurd. So what started, in October 7th itself, people were calling Israel genocidal. And over the weeks after, they kept using that word. It was a membership signal because it was absurd. And I even did a video, a science moment video in my series. I said, look, here it is. This is going to become now bubbling up more and more justifications for this crazy, batshit crazy idea will suddenly get sophisticated. And I mean sophisticated in a post hoc bullcrap way, but they will be sophisticated. They will spread across minds, and you will not be able to argue the person out of it. They'll just argue in circles. It's just like, it's all crazy, but it's all self-consistent crazy. And it becomes elaborate and sophisticated. And that's in fact what happened. So now everybody, half of my tweets on Twitter, if I'm just going through the whatever it is that they're serving me tweets, not just people I follow, are all people saying the genocide in Gaza this, the genocide in Gaza this. And all of them truly 100% believe what they're saying. And that's how all of these things work. They believe that masks work. They believe that it's truly genocide. And this is always the pathway from membership signal. Membership signal becomes totally 100% justified in the community through these sorts of evolutionary, in some sense, mechanisms.
So we're rounding out the hour, and I'm curious, closing statements. I have an attorney who's done closing statements before. Maybe that's the wrong term, but like any TV show, movie, I try to leave on an upbeat. So what are the upbeats? What are the things we can gain from all this?
Going back to Mark's point about social reputation, there was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, when you really could put a lid on the truth. We are here now having this discussion. Yes, we have to be careful because on one particular and very dominant platform, we can't really even still speak the truth. But because of technology, we do have the ability to express ourselves and to share our views and to offer them for examination in a way that was not possible in times when gatekeepers were the exclusive means of communication. And lunatics like us had to resort to sticking mimeograph sheets of paper on people's car windshields. There's a whole world of discussion and thought going on out there, and a lot of it is lunatics. But the lunatics have always found ways to talk to each other. So I'm optimistic that knowledge does win, that ultimately the more we talk and the more we communicate, the regime that we're operating in will render the know-nothingism and the this utter blindness to empirical truth eventually, and hopefully sooner rather than later, extinct.
Mark?
Well, I hope so, and I share some of that optimism. Certainly back in the day before the internet connected us all, we had individual countries which would fall into social manias, and it would have been harder probably to have the kind of free expression that may have, the free expression was not very good. But the worry is that now is when there is an occasional social mania, it doesn't stop at the borders. It really spreads worldwide. And we don't have much data to go on over the last 10 or 15 years, but it does feel like, and this is not a scientific claim, it does feel like every 3 or 4 months there's a new next thing. And we're much more susceptible to these kinds of social manias. And they have more time to evolve and bubble up in portions of the internet to be infectious to transmission across brains. So you take that as well as 2 different kinds of illnesses that are thrust upon free expression. Or 3 different kinds. One is censorship, 2 different categories: government top-down censorship, which is pretty much still happening everywhere in every country. And then the other is as bottom-up or private enterprise itself demanding censorship. Most of these countries are censoring top-down because their populace demands it. Because their populace thinks that's how you get true things on the internet, is by just having some fact checker say it. And it's pretty intuitive. Well, why wouldn't that be? Free expression is complex. Free expression is the mechanism by which we come to the truth, but it's not obvious, right? These are hard things. So that's the one problem. There's still censorship, which is making the ability for free expression to even work more likely to fail. The other is that these free expression networks, even when they're being unfettered by the state and by other kinds of actors, they aren't the public square. They're not exactly the kinds of spaces that you and I evolved for. In real life, if I'm in front of you and you're older than me, or you have certain kinds of specializations, like I do compared to some of the people that I argue with, right? I've got certain kinds of things that I'm good at. And in real life, they're going to have a certain kinds of emotional expressions to me. They're going to give me a little bit of, they'll show a little bit more humility, let's say. But on the internet, we don't have the same kinds of expressive repertoires that we have in real life. So we tend to be trolls, jerks, engage in different kinds of socio-emotional interactions. My last book is called Express the Human. It's the real language that humans, social animals, speak. We think that we are speaking in all of these propositions, but really the propositions are all peppered with confidence claims. No, it's saying, I really believe it, goddammit. And that's suddenly putting a huge amount of confidence around it. And we do this with emotional expressions, both showing disdain or respect for your view, or confidence or humility about mine. And all of these things are sort of in a framework. When free expression works well, it's because we have the ability to do these things to one another in a really effective way that the other person, if they absorb it, they immediately see these emotional expressions. And whereas on the internet, on Twitter and all these things, I think that in the future, hopefully they're trying to put little emotional expressions, like Facebook. You can pick like 6 emotional expressions, and we try to do more and more. Over time, the hope would be that they come up with better mechanisms to ensure that the kinds of communications that we have are the kinds that we're designed to have, which is really packing as much socio-emotional information in them as possible.
Well, that's amazing. I appreciate your guys spending the time with me and the world, as it turns out, intelligent world. I want to just pop in a quick self-promotion here. People want to help support my efforts here. They can buy my book. It's even better if they read it. It's has some resonance for what we're talking about here, because the truth, such as it is malleable. Zika is a real virus, and microcephaly is a real measurable syndrome at birth, but it just so happens one has nothing to do with each other. But that hasn't stopped people from carrying on for nearly a decade now about it. And there's $1 billion kind of bulwark of research and so forth. A lot of people are kind of feeding out the trough, as it were, and they still do it. And who suffers? The people who have to, stay indoors thinking a single mosquito bite is going to unalterably damage a cherished life within if they're pregnant. And so that's just kind of my foray. I'm working right now on this again, self-promotion stuff. I'm working on an article that's going to be in Brownstone, I believe, on the actual origin of the opioid epidemic. And I'll give you a hint. It starts with an M and ends in ethadone. And you can go from there. So that's kind of, I've tried to Google this term, whether anybody else has come up with this concept. But basically the harm reduction aspect of bringing on methadone maintenance treatment to cure heroin addiction with methadone, which is as dopey as, or more so than heroin, is an interesting phenomenon. It has aspects that we see in COVID. I'm going to leave it there. So people can follow me, and you guys are pretty much eponymous for your Twitter handles. As long as you can see the names at the bottom here, Mark Changizi and Ron Coleman. Go follow these guys. They're brilliant, and I loved having you guys on. So thank you so much. Any final words?
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.